The power and influence of the Earls of Kildare and later the Dukes of Leinster had held a position in the political hierarchy that reached its heights in the 15th century. The residual impact of that influence translated in the following centuries to a high social influence and social network that maintained the ability to move in the highest social circles. And indeed, as we heard from Colette's talk in the last series, they remain close friends with the British royal family. However, the 20th century saw the collapse of the Fitzgerald power dynasty that had begun in the 12th century. Careful marriages to young women were significant in their continued success in the maintenance of the life world they created for themselves at Carton. Leinster House and later Kilkea. Anthony Malcolmson writes wonderfully on the judicious marriages of the aristocracy and the upper middle classes. Colette's talk, as you will recall, mentioned that each successive earl just happened to fall madly in love with an heiress. Until we get to the 20th century, and more of that shortly. I want to begin with my first experiences of the Fitzgerald story and all its nuances. In 1973, when I first came to Maynooth as a bride, as a Canadian, with no Irish connections whatsoever, I knew nothing about the history of Ireland. I know that sounds hard to believe. I was thrilled to come to the historic town of Maynooth, but of course, at that time, it was a very different place to what it's become today. And looking around, I know all of you know what I'm talking about. In 1972, when we were living in London, Charlie, who's from Leixlip, heard from his friend Jim Carroll there was a small house going for sale in Leinster Cottages, and he hopped on the boat and bought it. It was a simpler time, what can I say? Now, this is the cottage, the romantic cottage that we bought. I was a bit dismayed. Although it was semi-derelict, we moved in anyhow and began the refurbishment and an extension. So far, so good. But one day, soon after our arrival, our neighbour, Mrs. Waldron, whose family had lived in Leinster Cottages for at least 2 generations, asked me in disbelief had I actually bought the house. I wasn't quite sure the context of the question, but I assured her we had. With dismay, she told me something she truly believed. It seemed, she told me, that Edward, the 7th Duke of Leinster, had sold his birthright to a moneylender, and that person had then sold the Leinster properties when he shouldn't have. The Duke had only to return to Carton for one night for everything to revert back to its ownership, and our house would no longer be ours. I was a bit dismayed, but as you can see, I would hardly be worried about the state of our house. It did, however, make me realize that there was some very interesting backstory that was operating here, and I began to ask questions. This is the sitting room / kitchen. I was very fortunate to come to Maynooth when I did, and of the many lasting friendships I have made, none was more pivotal than my friendship with Mary Cullen. In the late 1970s, Mary and I collaborated on publishing her Maynooth newsletter articles that Susan was referring to. And it was for this reason people began to think I knew more about local history than I did. And as a result, an American woman was directed to my door who threw the whole 20th century Leinster story into another very bizarre realm. This woman, Patricia Fitzgerald Roberts, told me that she was in Ireland trying to gather evidence about her father, Maurice Fitzgerald, whom she claimed was the rightful Duke of Leinster. I was a bit confused, but somehow she was suggesting that her father was Desmond Fitzgerald, son of the 5th Duke. But I said he died in 1916. His memorial stone is in the porch of the church. Oops. Oh, we're missing his memorial. Never mind. Oh no, she said, it's just a ruse to convince people that he had died. In fact, what had happened was that he had been involved in an inappropriate liaison with a young woman, a member of the royal family, and the Leinsters sent him off to America in disgrace and disinherited him. She went on to say that now that the 7th Duke had died, she was making the claim for her son, presently standing outside my house, chewing tobacco and spitting in the road. I was speechless. I had never in my life been in a position or had the life experience to question anything she said. Once she had gone, I quickly told Mary Cullen, and she was incredulous and could only suggest it was extremely far-fetched, as was agreed by other people I also told. This now was added to the list of what I didn't know about Maynooth. With the death of Gerald, the fifth Duke, in 1893, and his wife Hermione of tuberculosis in 1895, the care and administration of the Leinster estate, both of lands, houses, large and small, fell to the trustees. These were the sixth Duke's uncles, Frederick, and a distant cousin, Baron Kennard. Later, Henry, another uncle, stepped in, and later still the final papers, Henry's son, Dennis Henry, would appear as a trustee. It was initially Frederick who would become the manager of the Leinster estate for both the financial and the material aspects. Now, it's something of a romantic notion to think of the Leinsters living at Carton, but it appears the family, or at least the Duke and his family, spent only intermittent time at Carton. The Duke's unmarried brothers were certainly not there. The married ones had their own establishments, and later Kildare would become the home of 3 or 4 of the unmarried or widowed siblings. Oh, there's the memorial. I apologize for the disorder. From the secondary sources, it appears from the time of their father's death and probably before that, the family only visited Carton in the summer months. On the death of their parents, the 3 boys were still very young. Morris and Desmond were 7 and 8, and Edward just 3. And from them they were up without any strong well of family connection. It was at this point in their lives that the 3 boys' childhood connection to Carton was broken, when they were given into the guardianship of Hermione and Gerald's sisters, who lived in England and at Kildare in Kildare. Although Desmond was able to overcome the loss of his parents, his elder brother Morris, who had overwhelming mental health issues, did not. And with what we might consider inappropriate today, the youngest, Edward, was to live with his elderly aunts at Kildare. Although he was not Gerald's natural son, he was accepted as a son by him, and one wonders why he was not raised with his older brothers. Nevertheless, Edward had a romantic attachment to Ireland and to Carton, but the boys were certainly not raised here. Once they were adults, the First World War overwhelmed the natural social connections between England and Ireland, and unfortunately, once Morris, the 6th Duke, grew older, he developed what might be diagnosed today as a bipolar illness, at that time untreatable. And he spent his last years in an institution in Scotland, dying of pneumonia. The second son, Desmond, whom we see here, seemed to be a very personable young man. And anecdotal stories say he was concerned with the workers on the Carton estate and may actually have Leinster cottages refurbished. I heard in conversation with the Cromer family. Now, the Cromers were builders in Lucan, and Cromers seemed to be able to work for the landed gentry, and they did a lot of work. And Rodney told me that when the cottages were refurbished by the Cromers, they made them into a story and a half. But Desmond had expected 2-story cottages, and he was quite upset. But the trustees were even more upset because they didn't want him to spend any money on the cottages at all. So that was socially sophisticated and obviously with enough persona and money that he moved in the highest social circles. He had become friends with the Prince of Wales. His accidental death in 1916 in Calais during his military service, this meant that Edward was certain to become the next Duke, something his uncle and the trustees were not happy about. Now there's Kildare. where the family lived. Now, here we have. Now, you'll see that the images have credits on them. That's because I didn't pay for them. I just borrowed them. To say that Edward was a foolish and hedonistic individual was apparent in the way he lived his life, spending most of his 86 years in a storm of publicity. Even before the death of Desmond, he was living a wild playboy life that on the one hand made him an endearing fool, but on the other, a hopeless gambler whose actions would bring about the end of his family's influential position in society. At the end of his life, he was described by a friend as a very nice, very, very hopeless man. It was in this early period that he married his first wife, an actress, who gave birth in 1914 to their son Gerald, who would later become the 8th Duke. They divorced in 1930, and she died in 1935. One would ask, was this wild life perhaps a symptom of some fundamental need in Edward? But this can only be speculation, as many people who have a secure family life also fall off the rails. During the early years, the trustees had been prepared to pay off many of Edward's debts, but with time had become less willing, particularly as he made no attempt to mend his ways. By the end of 1918, Edward was in serious debt to moneylenders of £60,000, roughly 3 million in today's values, and he was declared bankrupt for the first time. But, like a fairy godfather, stepping into his life with an offer to rescue him was the very rich Sir Harry Malabedili, MP of Willesden East, London, and fundraiser of war loans, a sophisticated businessman. In the 1920s, his business empire had been bolstered by offering reasonably priced men's ready-made suits. And I discovered that he also had bought the publication that you may know, Burke's Peerage. So he was doing well. In a proposition I find quite unbelievable, Sir Harry offered to pay off Edward's debts in return for the rights to his inheritance of the Leinster estates. In return, Sir Harry would pay Edward £1,000 a year in tax-free allowances. The golden egg was that when Edward became Duke, with this contract, Sir Harry would become the recipient of all income from the Leinster estates, estimated at £50,000 per annum. Edward notified his trustees about this deal offered by Sir Harry, suggesting unless they came up a suitable provision to assist him, he was going to accept the offer. One can only imagine the trustees would have been very worried. And they were right to be worried, because they knew the full story of Morris's health issues and the consequences of the arrangement implied in the future. Refusing any alternative provisions they offered, Edward went ahead with Sir Harry's deal. Only after the contract had been signed and the money given over to the creditors was there some attempt to pull back from the deal. This resulted in a court case, ending in Sir Harry's favour, and a final contract was in place by 1920. In the 2 years since the initial contract, and after Sir Harry had taken out a life insurance on Edward for £300,000, the debts had risen to £67,500. But the final agreement was raised to cover this amount. At this remove, we cannot possibly see how anybody would be foolish enough to exchange a potential income of £50,000 for £1,000, when Edward's lifestyle easily exceeded that in a month. With debts continuously incurred, it would also have been impossible to repay the outlay received from Sir Harry, and it was only a matter of time before he became the de facto owner of Leinster estates. It must be said that Sir Harry, an astute businessman, would have investigated the background into Edward's likelihood of inheriting, and would have easily discovered that Morris was not a well man, and sooner rather than later Edward would inherit. There was, however, a clause for the repurchase of the revisionary rights, and this was £350,000 or £400,000, depending on who you read. One cannot possibly imagine if he couldn't find 60,000 to pay off his debts, he couldn't have found 350 anytime soon. There was also some speculation that the money obtained from the sale of portions of land and tenancies in 1908 through the Wyndham Act was invested in London properties, which Sir Harry would then also have been the beneficiary. However, although the newspapers reported that Fitzgerald's achieved, quote, nearly $1 million, they only achieved around 700,000. And the bulk of the investment, as Terry Dooley discusses, was put into land, which meant that no London properties were purchased. This apparently was not Sir Harry's only kindness. He also bought other properties that were alluded to in his wife's comment that he was a, quote, professional buyer-upper of estates on the rocks. He had purchased the whole of the Duke of Bedford's Covent Garden estate in 1913 for $2 million, having already been involved in the purchase of the Piccadilly Hotel and St James's Court, Buckingham Gate. On the death of Morris only 2 years later in 1922, Sir Harry famously acquired the control of the Leinster estates. At this time, the value of the estate was estimated as worth more than $2.5 million, and in addition, the heirlooms were valued at the best part of $2 million. This is at 1920 prices. Lord Frederick, regardless of the arrangement between Edward and Sir Harry, would continue to live at Carton during his lifetime. But part of the Leinster estate was Kildare, also under Sir Harry's control, which is where the three older Edward's aunts, Lady Nesta, Lady Mabel, and Lady Alice, and possibly Lord Walter, were living. In the years prior to the death of Anne Hamilton of Hamwood House, Colette Jordan and I were invited over to put her archive in order. The connection to Carton is key. This is because the Hamiltons had acted for a couple of generations as the land agents to Carton and other significant properties, also possibly Castletown. The Hamilton correspondence at Hamwood was, while not as full as what one would have hoped, still quite revealing. And the discovery of letters between Sir Harry, once he became the de facto owner in 22, and G.F. Charles Hamilton was really exciting. Although the full sequence of letters are not apparently intact, we can see the two men writing regularly to each other, either directly or through Sir Harry's solicitors. The two men see each other as allies, and the letters between them are respectful and conciliatory. Now, as much as I'd like to, I can't go through each of the letters. They're very interesting, but I think we want to get home at a reasonable time. I also want to look at the sale of the Leinster estate itself. So this will be a brief overview to set the scene. After 1922, when Harry obtained what the papers call proprietorship, there was an attempt under Hamilton's management to economize, and negotiations were undertaken to let employees go. The letters indicate, too, that Charles Hamilton's retirement had been suggested, obviously to save money, but Charles offered his CB to support his continuing in the role. And it appears his connection continued, and on his retirement, when the estate was sold in 1949, he received 3% of the sale money. The position of an estate manager for Carton was advertised in several Irish newspapers in 1949. Following the dismissal of numbers of the Carton and Kildare employees for cost-saving measures, the letters mention their pleas for their reinstatement, noting that while Kildare Castle costs $8,000 a year to maintain, the annual income from the Leinster estate stood at more than $45,000. Interestingly, despite instigating the dismissals, Sir Harry claimed that the remaining employees on the estate were still in the Duke's service, and there was, quote, no need to worry about the place changing hands. It's a puzzling idea. There is no reference to how much Carton is costing to maintain. Bearing in mind that this is not a good time in Irish history for secure pensionable employments, that one could have a great deal of sympathy for the estate workers. In 1923, Sir Harry did offer the revisionary rights back to the trustees for $180,000, with a requested deposit of $5,000 up front. However, this was a bit of a conundrum. Just to point out that the rights Edward sold were in fact his life interest in the capital money he received from the Wyndham Act in 1908. In a letter among the Hamilton papers from a solicitor who was acting as an outside arbiter, stated that the trustees could not use capital money to buy rights to capital money. They needed to apply to Sir Harry as the distributor of the funds to carry out the management of the whole enterprise. Therefore, if the only access to this money was through this channel, then it was impossible then to find the money to pay him. It could have been paid off in installments, but this was rejected by the arbiter, who also rejected an option of an Act of Parliament. It sounds like robbing Peter to pay Paul, really. It has to be remembered, too, that, as Terry Dooley points out, the capital money was invested, and therefore only dividends were being paid. So $700,000 of 1908 was not sitting in a glowing pile in the bank. Around 1928, vast amounts of the house contents, judged as heirlooms, were sold by the creditors. In the Hamilton letters, there's some discussion about this sale being held at Carton or in auction rooms, but eventually Sir Harry agreed that Carton could be used. Among the purchasers was Randolph Hearst, a magpie who was described by his dealer as the great acquisitor. There's some scope actually here for further research, because when I was looking into this, it seems that there was a warehouse somewhere in Maine where all of the European purchases were deposited and never distributed to his houses, and there's an inventory. So maybe it's possible to find what went to what was bought from Carton. Following the 1928 auction, it seems that the trustees didn't attempt to pay off Sir Harry because the money had gone to pay off Edward's additional ever-growing debts. In the following years, there was also an increasing pressure on the trustees and Edward from Sir Harry to sell the house. The contract agreed between Sir Harry and Edward stated they could together sell Carton, but both must benefit. And urged by Sir Harry, attempts were made by the trustees, but with no results. In two secondary sources, one on the American claimant to the Leinster dukedom that I was hinting at earlier, and the other on the disintegration of aristocratic dynasties, both authors report that all was not secure in Sir Harry's financial world, and in order to bolster up this, he had in fact mortgaged the rights to the Leinster estate and with the Legal and General Association Company, with the gamble that the monies from the Carton income would repay the loan. Well, this is interesting. There's no footnotes in their primary sources, and we can only accept it at face value. In 1936, the last Hamilton letters that include reference to Sir Harry and Edward occurred when when Edward wrote to Sir Harry announcing he was about to move into Carton. And by way of adding pressure, to what end we're not clear, he informs Harry that he is bringing two reporters from the Irish Times and the Daily Express who will, quote, report if there's any unpleasantness on your part. In the letters that follow are instructions to Hamilton to take a passive-aggressive stance, eject Edward's servants and the other person he has brought with him. Now, this other person was in fact Edward's second wife, Raphael, and to inform the local shops not to supply his staff with provision. This was on the advice of Sir Harry's solicitors to avoid an expensive court case to attempt to have him removed for trespassing. This does sound a bit harsh, but the settlement meant that Sir Harry was tenant for life, and any infringement was technically trespass, particularly as Sir Harry had not invited Edward and his entourage to stay at Sir Harry's expense. How long he stayed, I haven't been able to work out. In 1932, despite having been instructed to go to America to find a rich bride, Edward made the mistake of marrying a penniless woman, Raphael Kennedy. An attractive young woman, as you can see from the pictures here. She was socially sophisticated, accepted by the high social circles of London society and Edward's extended family, not to mention members of the royal family. This marriage lasted until 1946. In his third marriage, he did marry into money, but the liaison was not to last. Jessie Smither, Countess of Kirsten, also known by her stage name Denise Orme, she attracted some other high flyers, among them her first husband, the third Baron, her second husband, the millionaire Theodore Wessel, and well, it's a bit of a come down to marry Edward. Perhaps, as Raphael claims, it was his title and his needy personality, but certainly not his bank account that attracted her. Now, through this woman, we have a small rabbit hole to fall into. Joan, her eldest daughter by her first husband, first married Leo Guinness, and then Ali Khan. And their son, Karim, is the late Aga Khan, the gentleman who just recently died. So it's an interesting connections. Following Jessie's death in 1960, he would marry again to Vivian Felton, who outlived him. My doctorate really was sparked by this network of relations among the elite of society, and it can really become a consuming occupation, especially if you start dipping into the peerage.com. Don't go there. Even if the relationship with Edward was fraught, Sir Harry and his wife seemed to be on good terms with the Fitzgeralds, because it was reported in the Daily Express that they attended the wedding of Jared, Marquess of Kildare, and Joan McMurrogh Kavanagh in 1936. Harry would also assist Gerald financially later on as he went into the aviation business. Now I'm going to just show you this picture, and it's from the 1960s. It's out of chronological order, but it shows Edward and his son on the left. Although this only shows Gerald's eldest son and his grandson, the little boy on his knee, he in fact had 4 other children, 3 daughters and a son. And just to remind us, in the background, you can see the second Duke. And this reminds me that the Baron Kinnaid that I mentioned earlier, this was the great-grandson of the second Duke. So everything's always connected. At this point, when Edward was entering his third bankruptcy, the trustees do offer Sir Harry $250,000 for the revisionary rights, but he is reluctant to accept this, probably because he spent so much more on the upkeep in the previous 14 years. That wasn't enough for a return. It may also that he was thinking of his the future benefit for his own son and grandson. It may be said that if it hadn't been for Sir Harry, Carton and the Leinster estates that included Kilkenny would have been frittered away by Edward and broken up between his creditors. Lord Fitzgerald wrote to Harry before his death in 1925 thanking him. Sir Harry would subsequently go on to pay for the upkeep of the Carton estate until his death. On Sir Harry's death, the revisionary rights passed on to his son, Sir Guy Merrick. Although limited correspondence between Charles Hamilton and Sir Harry's solicitors continues on for a couple of years, after Sir Harry's death, there was no resolution to the sale of the house. And interesting, during the Second World War, it was occupied by the Irish Army, the headquarters of the 2nd Infantry Division. And I was told there was a video, a film made of the Irish Army at Carton. And I searched every repository that I could possibly think of, and even some that I was told about, and I could find nothing. But maybe it's out there someplace. The indentures included in the deeds of our house show that the Leinster estate became Carton Properties Limited in 1947. And one might have assumed that with Sir Guy's death, the previous year, the rights went back, or that Sir Anthony Merrick, now of Adelia, was the de facto owner of the Leinster estates, and the revisionary rights, nevertheless, CPL, Carton Properties Limited, was created. After this, the Carton domain, the enclosed estate we know, was purchased by Arthur Rowland Niall Kane, 2nd Baron Brockett. He was a multi-millionaire Tory peer and businessman whose principal residence was Brockett Hall in Herefordshire, England. This sale did not include tenancies, farms, and lands of Maynooth and the surrounding countryside. Not until 1951 did Carton properties go to Lord Brockett for what I understand was $62,000, a sum that would be today's values at $101,800,000. Unfortunately, Sir Arthur's policies, what we used to jokingly call a slightly right of Genghis Khan, but I suppose today you might be straightforward and say he was a fascist with considerable Nazi sympathies. Fortunately, he never actually lived at Carton. Arthur's eldest son, Charles, predeceased him. We can see him here in this picture. And his grandson, Charles Rowland, became the 3rd Lord Brockett. Charles was a minor celebrity in the early 2000s. You may have heard him doing silly things and of his conviction for fraud. Arthur left Carton to his 2nd son, the Honourable David Lawrence Niall Kane, who inherited Carton in 1967. And in another interesting little rabbit hole, Lord Brockett's daughter Rose married the 6th Marquess of Hertford, and their son is the current Marquess. Having long wanted to divest themselves of the responsibility of Carton, and everything comes together with the sale agreed in place. The sale of the contents begins in May 1949 and takes place over several days. Sales were reported in various newspapers and include a rather large painting described as being 30 feet by 18 feet. It's not quite for your local suburban house. Gazing by a river, of cattle grazing by a river. It's probably by Albrecht Jacobson Kuyp, going for sale in today's money of 3,700 sterling. I'm giving you all the prices from now on in today's money value, might as well. But another smaller one with a dead game and fruit and hounds achieved even more at 5,500. And here are 2 examples. Now, this is not necessarily them, but these are my friend has suggested that were for sale. He didn't ever have any pictures, but this is very typical of the style. Now, if we look at if we remind you of Castletown here on your left, we can see such a similarity between his and Kuyp's work, this work and Kuyp. So one would like to imagine that it is by him. And certainly the Duke of Leinster back in the day would have had a lot of influence in decorating Castletown. An antique shared mahogany dining table achieved 1,000, and a similar priced Turkey carpet of 30 by 20 feet went for 1,800. A satisfactory 4,000 was achieved from Adams Waterford wall light with a mirror back. Of the silver, a christening mug with a swing handle dated 1733 was the star of the day, selling for nearly 10,000. The newspapers go on to list other items of furniture and household goods, among them the Chinese wallpaper that eventually went for 2,400. This was either never removed or returned because it remains at Carton. Book sales in the following month were lower than usually expected. An original history of the Dominicans in Ireland, 1762, sold for £238, when it should have obtained £700. Last year's Mealy sold a copy of this for 4,400. One final item that is really amazing is this one here. This Captain Henry James Ware sketches of America. It was originally sold for £1,000, and today it's being offered online for £60,000 to £72,000. So quite a bit. In 1949, a friend of mine, Mary Fisher, the wife of the Archdeacon Fisher of Church of Ireland rector here in Maynooth, was at the auction buying books by the shelf. And when she and her husband retired, because I was one of their flock, they invited us to help them move their books, because she was selling them all to Pamela Fegan, or Pamela Fegan was going to sell them for her. And I recall I was astonished by the quality of the books that I was heaving around. I certainly remember Taylor and Skinner, The Highways of Ireland, 1776, and I think, but I'm not certain, an original Palladio, which just blew my mind. And I have never seen books like it since then. I don't seem to be able to avoid rabbit holes tonight. In 1977, the Honourable David Niall Kane sold Carton Domain to Powerscreen, of whom the Maligan family were partners. They subsequently bought the domain from Powerscreen. I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend Connor's talk recently. In 2017, the Malahans sold Carton House and the commercial areas of the estate, the golf course and other sports facilities, to John Mullen for $57 million. It's presently being run by the Fairmount Hotel Group. Now, this map is not very good, but it's really not meant for you to see in great detail. I'd like to point out the two different shades of green, or the big shade of green, which is the Carton, the domain, and then along this side here, all these numbers, this is the village, this is the town of Maynooth, with all the numbers. And this is what was Carton Properties. So I'm going to show you a map of Maynooth in a minute, but all these outlying little farms or plots of land were all Carton Properties, not the domain. In the post-Fitzgerald era, the houses and lands in the Carton Properties that Lord Brocket acquired slowly began to sold off, hence the alarm of my neighbour, Mrs. Mary Waldron. Now, like the Hamilton letters, there are too many items for us to cover, and I'm only going to show you two examples that you might recognize. You might be familiar with Dawson's. This is Dawson's right here on the main street. This land direct, Now this is the land direct map, and it shows you where Dawson's is on the map of the street of Maynooth. Now on this page is at the very top right here, number 99, we can see Mary Dawson. And so she owns this property described as, no, it's not described, but it's a house, a shop, and out offices. Now we can see here that in 1935, Michael Riley became the tenant of the property owned by the Duke. It had previously been leased by Joseph Dawson, then run by his wife, I presume, Mrs. Dawson, and operated as the shop. Now this is moving forward now into the 1950s, and we can see here Michael Riley, right here. We can see Carton Properties are selling to Michael Riley in 1957. So the previous one, the valuations that we saw, he was still leasing it. He was leasing it, as you can see, from the Duke of Leinster. So this is a question. If Lord Brocket was supposed to have bought Carton Properties, why is the Duke of Leinster's name still on the valuations? Questions. So here we go. So, and then as I was talking to you about my house, Leinster Cottages, there we can see in 1968, the cottages are beginning to be sold. This is John Gleeson, from whom we bought the house. And then our neighbor, Ellen Rossiter, who was obviously bought hers at the same time. The names of individuals who leased Leinster Cottages are not listed. Some would have been estate employees, and by the 1960s, members of the general population. Now, before we close, I'm going to dip down one final rabbit hole. At the end of my appointment at the sales at the Registry of Deeds, where you look all these things up, I decided I might look and see what happened before it was Carton properties. And look what I found. All these properties for sale under the heading Leinster, which is as in Duke. This is throwing up some very interesting possibilities. Picking the arbitrary year of 1930 to start moving forward, I discovered that between 1930 and 1954, when the name books go online, 76 of the Leinster properties were sold, probably by the trustees. These sales are largely concerned with Kildare Town, Castletown, and Athy. This presents an interesting source of income, or possibly assets that haven't been factored into the story of the Leinster estates. Without a search for each Kildare memorial, I could only conclude there was a considerable amount of property outside the control of Sir Harry that trustees could sell, and did so for the maintenance of either their own inheritance or Edward's lifestyle, or, let's be honest, his debts. Now, I hope this gives some interesting insight into the hidden history of Carton, from a time when the Carton domain was fully functioning with the family in charge, through struggles to maintain the edifice of the social history in connection to Carton and the Fitzgerald. It has all vanished. On the plus side, of course, is the present situation, where echoes of that romantic past have been reimagined and can be experienced at the Fairmount Hotel. For research in the future, there's plenty of potential to carry out a further survey of the town in the Registry of Deeds throughout the 20th century, before the explosion of the population in the 1970s and the metamorphosis of the university from the Pontifical College to the National University. We have to bear in mind, of course, that we have to gather the information about the 20th century, because just trying to work it out, it's already been 100 years since Sir Harry acquired Carton. 1922, and now it's 2025. So, there's a lot of time has passed. Who's remembering? And if we don't start talking about it and laying down memories, it's all going to vanish, and we're going to have even more trouble working things out. Thank you very much for your attention.